Hi, Misha here. And last time we talked about the Lockheed EC-121, the Warning Star. This was an early aerial early warning craft, and it was kind of pressed into the role of command and control during the Vietnam War with mixed results. And as I talked about in that video, now we're going to talk about its successor, at least as far as the Air Force was concerned. The Boeing E-3 Sentry. This is a purpose-built airborne early warning aircraft. Also control, or I should say command, control, and communications, or AWACS. This is kind of the quintessential AWACS airplane. Still very much in American, NATO, and French use to this very day. And so it's seen quite a bit of use throughout the 80s, 90s, and into the 21st century in various operations today. Like the Warning Star, it's unarmed. Its primary armament as such is its pulse Doppler radar and the radidome that rotates on top. So with that, we'll talk about what Boeing delivered to the U.S. Air Force. By the way, this model, like the other, is a 1/144 scale diecast from Corgi, and it's of a U.S. Air Force E-3 from Tinker Air Force Base, circa 1976. In the 60s, the Air Force was already looking to replace and expand the EC-121 and take advantage of new technologies and, frankly, just new military concepts. One of these was new computing, both hardware and software, as well as new radar with look-down capability. This really goes all the way back to 1963, when the earliest proposals for a new early warning aircraft were kind of cast about. And then they got serious towards the end of 1965 when a new office to basically design the AWACS came to be. And initially we had 3 companies that were contracted to kind of come up with proposals. Of course, we had Boeing, we had Douglas, later McDonnell Douglas, and we had Lockheed, because of the Warning Star. However, Lockheed was very quickly ruled out by the summer of 1966. This left Boeing and McDonnell Douglas. And Boeing's design was based on its successful 707 civilian commercial passenger liner, which first went into commercial service in 1958. Likewise, McDonnell Douglas's aircraft was based on its DC-8. Now, interestingly, Boeing proposed a clean sheet design to the Air Force, but it was decided this wouldn't really give an advantage, and there were several advantages to kind of sticking with a tested airframe. They also considered changing the engines around, but in the end, they didn't. Now, moving forward to early 1967, the whole project was kind of brought together because it wasn't just an airframe they needed a new radar system, the whole suite. And the 2 contenders would quickly become Westinghouse and Hughes. Hughes had become famous for its work with the F-102 and F-106. From that point onward, we'd have a competition between McDonnell Douglas and Boeing, and then in 1970, Boeing's design was selected. And initially 2 prototype models designated as EC-137D were ordered, and each of these was to carry one of the 2 radar sets, one Hughes, one Westinghouse. And so Boeing would build these using converted 707, so they were relatively quick to get together, and the first would fly in February of 1972. And with these two ready to go, a fly-off for the new radar sets would occur from March through June, July of that year. And then in September of 72, the Westinghouse design was selected. And it was selected mainly because it was a more modern design. It used more digital components, and its computer system had more memory and, frankly, just advanced hardware over the Hughes. So, with all that said, by early 1973, approval was given for final development and pre-production. 3 more pre-production aircraft with the Westinghouse system were ordered. And the first of these, finally designated as the E-3, would fly in February of 1975. And from that point on, they would enter into full production by 76 with the first new Sentries delivered to the Tinker Air Force Base in March of 1977. And these would be the first of ultimately 34 delivered to the United States Air Force. And this is, of course, around the same time we were able to see the retirement of the Warning Star. Now, in the Navy, this was replaced by various other aircraft, including the E-2 Hawkeye, which actually went into service quite a bit earlier than the E-3, as you might imagine. This was a pretty impressive aircraft for its day, and still very much holds its own today, thanks to several upgrade programs. The E-3 is certainly not a small aircraft, as you would imagine, being based on a passenger liner. It's nearly 153 feet long and has a wingspan just under 146 feet. It is powered by 4 engines. They did consider as many as 8 during development, as well as upgrading them, but they ended up kind of just sticking with what worked. Its maximum speed is just over 530 miles per hour. However, because of its mission, long duration, it likes to cruise at about 360 miles per hour, which is still well over 100 miles per hour greater cruise speed than the Warning Star, and a maximum top speed of nearly 150 miles per hour more. Not bad. Whereas the Warning Star had a max altitude of about 25,000 feet, this has a relative cruise altitude of about 29,000 to 30,000 feet and can go a bit higher if necessary. The main thing is, because of its mission, was duration. It can go, well, the earlier versions, like the A and the B and the C's, could do 8 hours or more without refueling, but these were all set up for aerial refueling, so pretty much indefinite. Later versions, like the D and some of the G's, could extend that to 10, even 11 hours without refueling. So not bad, guys. We have a flight crew of 4. We have a commander, a pilot, a navigator, and a flight engineer. That's kind of standard amongst all variants. The initial E-3A had around 13 people in the back to operate the radar, the rotodome, and its equipment and servicing it. Later versions, like the E-3C, would up this to 17 AWACS personnel, communications and whatnot, and in some instances the crew could be 19 specialists with still the 4 flight crew. So yeah, anywhere from 17 to 23 people on board. And And inside, it's pretty well appointed, and it has a lot of very interesting equipment. As you would imagine, for the day, it had a very advanced computer system made by IBM, and it had DOS, which is actually something that wasn't upgraded until quite recently. Now, before someone says, well, actually, yeah, it wasn't technically DOS, but it was like DOS. Finally, they got to upgrade to the Windows 95 in the 21st century, so again, woohoo. The inside, there are several bays and compartments, some for intelligence gathering, radar monitoring, others for communications, command and control areas, and of course it can be configured and all that. Earlier versions would have a few less, but by the 3B, there would be 14 stations for the AWACS personnel to operate, and then of course with later upgrades, these would go to full color displays and all that good stuff too. I guess you could probably even watch YouTube on it, maybe even this video. And of course, there would be not only a small kitchen, a small galley, there would be a small rest area with some bunks, and there would be one toilet in the front and one toilet in the back for the standard model, although some specialist versions like those made for Saudi Arabia would have a total of 3 toilets because, I don't know, why not? And of course the heart of this is the radome up here. It does rotate on this model because, sure. This is in real life, a big old dish. It's about 30 feet across. It's about 6 foot tall at the center. It's nearly 12 foot off the fuselage. Now, interestingly, it's not pressurized. It houses the antenna for various systems with most of the control elements inside the fuselage. And it's a pulse Doppler radar with several modes. Some are for tracking aerial targets at medium and high altitudes. It can detect them out to 400 miles, maybe even greater. If you're talking low flying or surface targets, that's down to about 200 to 250 miles. It also has a specific mode for tracking maritime objects, ships. And it has an over-the-horizon mode and the ability to even estimate height and all that for targets. So it's pretty darn advanced radar system. A huge improvement over the Warning Stars. Now, just for fun fact, this dome, when it's in kind of the standby mode, just to kind of keep it going, it rotates fully about every 4 minutes. But when it's in fully active mode, it can rotate up to 6 times per minute. So it can get a good spin on for quick refreshes of just kind of the world around it. The initial version, the E-3A, started to be delivered to the Air Force, like I said, in 1977. They would take 24, as well as the 2 EC-137Ds. They were updated to the E-3A standard. Next, before they could even finish the initial order for 34 for the Air Force, Boeing would switch over to the E-3B, which had several product improvements and upgrades. And this would be 10, fulfilling the contract. Then, starting in the mid-80s, you would have the E-3C upgrade, which was an upgrade improvement to the radar system, the radome, and again, some other improvements. But it wasn't just for the U.S. Air Force. In fact, from very early on, NATO was interested. Concerned with bombers and missiles from the Soviet Union, as early as 1978, a new command structure was established for Europe, for NATO, And by 1980, they were interested very much in the new E-3, and deliveries would begin in 1982, and they would acquire 18. And it's interesting because the E-3 Sentries were among the very few truly NATO-owned assets in Europe. The final of 34 aircraft were delivered to the U.S. Air Force in the summer of 1984, and the majority of the Sentries were and still are based out of Tinker, although a detachment, usually around 4, are stationed off of Japan for operating in the Pacific. So yeah, production would continue. Now, interestingly, Boeing would quit making the 707 around 1978, which kind of let it focus primarily on the E-3 here. So after the success in NATO, around 1986-87, both France and Great Britain were interested in purchasing their own variants, and the British version will be known as the E-3D. It was interesting because it had upgraded engines. It also had increased capability, maritime detection, also better ECM. And then a version for France would be the E-3F, with similar upgrades to customize it for the French, who did not operate in line with NATO, but more adjunct to it. In between 91 and 92, 7 would be delivered to the UK and 4 to France. Backing up a bit, 5 E-3As would be delivered to Saudi Arabia, as well as a handful of tanker variants, which is kind of interesting. Nevertheless, production would end in 1992 with a total of 68 Sentries built by Boeing. And of course, these would see deployment as command and control craft throughout the 80s, and the E-3 would be one of the first airplanes to go on station for Operation Desert Shield in 1990. They would be there for, observation, detection, early warning, command and control, the usual stuff. This is really where it becomes an airborne headquarters. It serves several roles, and of course this would continue into 1991 with Desert Storm. One fun fact is the E-3s would record essentially the entire and complete air war for the Gulf, and this would be the first time in history we would have such complete data. They would fly a lot of missions, performing many roles. They would help coordinate friendly strike aircraft to their targets, also warn them of incoming Iraqi MiGs or SAM firing from the ground, but they would also help coordinate ground attacks. And even though there was a lot of electronic chatter going on, they proved to be very hardened against interference and also able to generate a lot of interference of their own. But they had a very good reputation from the Gulf War. And in the 1990s, these would be used to coordinate operations over the former Yugoslavia, and of course in the Kosovo in 1999, and so on and so forth. And in 1996, Northrop Grumman would purchase Westinghouse, which meant they took over maintenance and updating and repairing of the radar systems featured in these. And this would really be when the upgrade programs would start. The first ones would begin in the very late 80s, running through the 90s for both U.S. Air Force as well as NATO Sentries. I'm not going to list all the upgrade programs off here. One, it would be boring. Two, it wouldn't really be my field of expertise, and I'd be kind of talking out of my ass. Suffice it to say, they were mostly to do with the electronics and computer. Also, the ECM was updated. They got, a lot better computers, display systems, In the 21st century, they would update the cockpit avionics and controls. They would add GPS, things of that nature. This is also when the older U.S. Air Force 3As were updated to 3C standard. They would go Block 30, 35s. And then actually, beginning in the 20-teens, they would work on kind of a mid-life upgrade program, going to Block 40, 45, becoming the E-3Gs. And the first of these would reach initial operational readiness in the summer of 2015 and would be deployed to the Middle East to help combat terrorist, ISIS, ISIL, whatever you like to call it, things. But that program was stymied by a few different things. Now, one thing to point out, the Air Force would lose a couple of these to accidents. One famous one in 1995 up in Alaska, where the crew of 22 was killed. A couple others were retired out. And with the E-3G upgrade program, it was decided to go ahead and retire 7 more and upgrade 24. So kind of slowly drawing down the fleet because, yeah, they're getting quite old. Remember, the youngest ones were made in 1983, delivered in 84. Similarly, the UK no longer operates all 7. In fact, usually they only have about 2 in any given time that are fully capable. France still operates its small fleet, though. And as far as I know, so does Saudi Arabia. But it can't be denied that this is not a young design. However, it's still probably the most advanced early warning command control communication AWACS type aircraft in the world. It has a very powerful, very capable radar, and internally it's well appointed and equipped to handle a command staff, to control and then evaluate threats, and pretty much just whatever it is. It's a airborne command post, and for that reason, most users plan to keep these in service well into the 2030s, and there have been many programs to keep them up to date and competitive in the modern battlefield. Nevertheless, a time will come when this will become hopelessly obsolete. I mean, this is technology that started off in the mid to late 60s. It was developed in the 70s and produced in the 80s. There's only so much upgrading and updating you can do before more modern aircraft come in and just kind of own it. So who's to say? Nevertheless, it still ends up being kind of the pride of the U.S. Air Force. This wasn't operated by the Navy. Again, they had their own aircraft. Its main users, again, were the U.S., France, the U.K., NATO, which is still interesting that they actually have their own aircraft forces. Of course, it was, different things from different, but, and Saudi Arabia. There's also a few 707s used as training aircraft for these, but these are mostly out of production, and that's kind of where we're at. The radar system is getting quite old. The 707 hasn't been made in a long time. It's getting harder and harder to source parts for some of the components here. So it'll be interesting to see how much longer this can stay effective and current, and what might replace it. The UK has a few plans. The Air Force always has plans, but who knows what will come to fruition. But you have to admit, it's had a good run. It's been in service for over 40 years, and it looks like it'll hit the 50-year mark, kind of joining Boeing's other aircraft of fame, the B-52. Boeing builds them to last, and the Boeing aircraft really seem to stay in service for a while. And I think part of it is how modular and upgradable they prove to be. Plus, hey, it's got a kitchen, a bed, and a toilet on board. What else do you really need? But yeah, I just thought this would be a neat model. Actually, I bought these as a pair. They're actually older Corgis, but there's some that Aikens found in storage back around Christmas. I really like the Warning Star. I think it's a neat name and the model's neat. But this one is super cool. I mean, obviously the bones are there for a 707, but the extensions, it's pretty much all metal except for the rotodome. Kinda neat. That's plastic, but the wings, tail, all that's metal. And of course it does have gear up or down, and it does have a metal stand. At least the stem is metal, the base is plastic, but it's pretty substantial even in this scale. I have, you know, one of their B-52s, and it's even bigger and even more impressive. But this one's not easy to find shelf space for, that's for sure. And I like electronic and command type aircraft. They're interesting. This is certainly a necessary component of modern warfare. Absolutely. And has a pretty good safety record. For example, that one that was lost in '95 up in Alaska, it was actually taken down by Canadians. Canadian geese, that is. They flew into the engines. They took down 2 of them. I think they were both on the same side, meaning the aircraft could no longer maintain altitude. Because this dome is not light and requires a boatload of power. So yeah, I haven't really talked about such aircraft before. And I've mentioned the E-2 Hawkeye in the past, but I guess I'll have to get back to that pretty soon. So let me know what you think about the E-3 Sentry. Early warning detection craft that can figure out anything that's coming near it within 400 miles. At least as long as it's not too advanced. Stealthy. But we're living in a world of 5th, maybe even coming up on 6th generation stealth craft. So you never know what might sneak up on it. Anyway, if you could, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you feel like it, I'd welcome a comment below. With that, I appreciate you tuning in and hanging out with me. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.